The negative and apophatic knowledge of God in general. The knowledge of God by means of the logoi of nature, of the development of human life, and of Scripture represents the affirmative way of our knowledge of Him. But as we have seen in the progress of this knowledge, the consciousness that God surpasses that which can be understood about Him in concepts and words becomes stronger and stronger. On the peak of this progress, it becomes predominant. So at the beginning, the affirmative way is less dependent on the consciousness of the ineffable character of God. Later, it is more so. After a long ascent, it becomes almost totally dependent on the consciousness of the inability to comprehend and express God in concepts. So thought uses, along with affirmative concepts and expressions, negative ones, and after a long spiritual ascent, almost only in the negative. But these negative concepts and expressions don't express the feeling of the soul that God can't be known by any means. In other words, negative theology isn't only a unilateral action, the simple consciousness of the intellectual impotence of knowing God, but in it a feeling of the incomprehensibility of God is also expressed, an experience of Him which grows along with the spiritual ascent of man. This experience can also be expressed in certain positive terms, but equipped with corrections which show that their usual meaning isn't intended. For example, this experience is called a vision of God, or a vision of the divine light, higher than any feeling, etc. All the Eastern Fathers have spoken of such an understandable feeling, of such a vision of God, of an experience of Him. In order to distinguish between a simple negation of the knowability of God and this experience of Him, gained not by the powers of human nature but by the Holy Spirit, we will use for the first expression negative theology, and for the second apophatic theology. Sometimes, however, even in the use of the negative terms, a mystical experience of God can be expressed. We make this distinction because usually in Roman Catholic theology, along with the affirmative, only negative theology is known in the sense of a simple intellectual renunciation of the affirmative terms. It is to Vladimir Lossky's credit that in recent times he brought apophaticism to Orthodox theological consciousness as a dominant characteristic of Orthodox theology. And it is also to his credit that he has specified that the apophaticism of the Fathers is something else than the intellectual negative theology known in Roman Catholic theology. Negative and apophatic knowledge. We will state Lossky's description of this apophaticism and then add some explanations, since it seems to us that he describes it mostly in negative terms. And furthermore, he doesn't include that theme so essential to Orthodox apophaticism, and namely the vision of the divine light. Lossky begins by pointing out two ways of the knowledge of God, according to Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius distinguishes two possible theological ways. One, that of cataphatic or positive theology, proceeds by affirmations. The other, apophatic or negative theology, by negations. The first leads us to some knowledge of God, but in an imperfect way. The perfect way, the only way which is fitting in regard to God, who is of His very nature unknowable, is the second, which leads us finally to total ignorance. All knowledge has as its object that which is. Now God is beyond all that exists. In order to approach Him, it is necessary to deny all that is inferior to Him. That is to say, all that which is. It is by unknowing, agnosia, that one may know Him, who is above every possible object of knowledge. Proceeding by negations, one ascends from the inferior degrees of being to the highest, by progressively setting aside all that can be known, in order to draw near to the unknown in the darkness of absolute ignorance. For even as light, and especially abundance of light, renders darkness invisible, even so the knowledge of created things and excess of knowledge destroys the ignorance, which is the only way by which one can attain to God Himself. After this general description, Lossky continues. If we transfer Dionysius' distinction between negative and affirmative theology to the plane of the dialectic, we are faced with an antinomy, which we then seek to resolve. In the attempt to make a synthesis of the two opposed ways, we bring them together as a single method of knowing God. It is thus that St. Thomas Aquinas reduces the two ways of Dionysius to one, making negative theology a corrective to affirmative theology. In attributing to God the perfections which we find in created beings, we must, according to St. Thomas, deny the mode according to which we understand these finite perfections. But we may affirm them in relation to God modo sublimiori. We may indeed ask how far this very ingenious philosophical invention corresponds to the thought of Dionysius. If for the author of the Areopagitica, if for the author of the Areopagitica there is an antinomy between two theologies which he distinguishes, does he admit this synthesis of the two ways? Solowski proposes that Dionysius's mystical theology be analyzed in order to concentrate on the true nature of the apophaticism, which constitutes the fundamental character of the whole theological tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church. He then reproduces in continuation, almost word for word, chapter 1, text 3 of the Mystical Theology, where it says that we have to give up rational activity, all perceptible or intelligible objects, everything that is and is not, in order to attain in absolute ignorance union with him who is above all existence and all knowing. It is already evident that this is not simply a question of a process of dialectic, but of something else. A purification, a catharsis, is necessary, because Dionysius is, as quoted by Losky, says, "One must abandon all that is impure and even all that is pure. One must then scale the most sublime heights of sanctity, leaving behind all the divine luminaries, all the heavenly sounds and words. It is only thus that one may penetrate to the darkness wherein he who is, beyond all created things, makes his dwelling." This ascent is compared by Dionysius with that of Moses on Sinai. Moses begins by purifying himself. Then Dionysius, again cited by Losky, says, He hears the many notes of the trumpets. He sees the many lights which flash forth many pure rays. Then he is separated from the many, and with the chosen priests he reaches the heights of the divine ascents. Even here he does not associate with God. He does not contemplate God, for he is unseen, but the place where he is. I think this means that the highest and most divine of the things which are seen and understood are a kind of hypothetical account of what is subject to him who is over all. In other words, certain hypothetical reasons, logoi, of the attributes of him who is totally transcendent, Losky, or the symbolic language of things subordinate to him who himself transcends them all, Dionysius. Through these things, his incomprehensible presence is shown walking upon those heights of his holy places which are perceived by the mind. Only then is Moses freed from the seen and those who see, and plunged into the darkness of unknowing, wherein he renounces all the apprehensions of his understanding and is enwrapped in that which is wholly intangible and invisible, belonging wholly to him that is beyond all things and to no one else, whether himself or another, and being through the passive stillness of all his reasoning powers united by his highest faculty to him who is wholly unknowable, of whom thus by a rejection of all knowledge he possesses a knowledge that exceeds his understanding. On the basis of this text, Losky concludes, It is now clear for Dionysius that the apophatic way or mystical theology, for such is the title of the treatise devoted to the way of negations, has for its object God, insofar as he is absolutely incomprehensible. Losky finds the foundation of the divine incomprehensibility in the Dionysian system in the fact that for the latter's Christian conception, God doesn't stand in continuity with the world, as Plotinus is one. According to Plotinus, the mind must forsake all things in order to reach the one, because they represent fragments of the one, not because it is beyond all things and incomprehensible by nature. It is possible to reach the essence of the one after the mind has been simplified, because it is in continuity with the multiplicity of things. But it isn't possible to reach God even after we have surpassed all things, because between them and God there is a discontinuity of nature which can't be overcome by the mind. The discontinuity of nature is shown by the uncreated nature of God and by the created nature of all things that are and of which we are a part. This makes me think even more strongly that Dionysius must have been in the Cyrillian line, Cyrilla of Alexandria, because the way in which God is united, God's humanity or divinity is united to humanity in Christ in Saint Cyril is apophatically. It's through God's self-emptying, and thus there's nowhere where you can point to in Christ and say, there is God, there is God, there is God. And so the problem of Dionysius's saying there's one theandric energy disappears when you consider that the divine energy of God is apophatically expressed, and thus you can't point to it. It manifests itself as energizing that which it is not, and thereby you cannot see it or apprehend it, even when it's acting, even if you can properly ascribe characteristics to that divine energy. And so the one theandric energy is the expression of the two energies in synergy. This is a basis of the divine incomprehensibility affirmed by the apophaticism of Eastern theology. This apophatic content, says Losky, was also defended by the great Cappadocians against Eunomius, who argued for the possibility of expressing the essentials of divinity in rational concepts. Losky discovers apophaticism in most of the fathers as a religious attitude in the face of the divine incomprehensibility. According to Clement of Alexandria, the very consciousness of the inaccessibility of God can only be gained by grace. The theme of Moses approaching God in the darkness of Mount Sinai, first used by Philo of Alexandria, will be the figure preferred by the fathers to express the experience of the inaccessibility of the divine nature. St. Gregory of Nyssa consecrates a special treatise to the life of Moses, in which the ascent on Mount Sinai toward the darkness of incomprehensibility is considered as the way of contemplation, preferable to Moses' first encounter with God, when he appeared to him in the burning bush. Moses knows God because he realizes that he can't know him. Then Moses saw God in light. Now he enters the darkness, leaving behind him all that can be seen or known. There remains to him only the invisible and unknowable, but in this darkness is God. Our spiritual ascent does not but reveal to us, ever more and more clearly, the absolute incomprehensibility of the divine nature. Filled with an ever-increasing desire, the soul grows without ceasing, goes forth from itself, reaches out beyond itself, and in so doing is filled with yet greater longing. Thus the ascent becomes infinite, the desire insatiable. As can be seen by apophaticism, Losky doesn't mean negative theology as an intellectual operation, because the experiencing of the divine incomprehensibility doesn't require only an intellectual purification, as the Platonic system does, but a renunciation of the whole created realm. It means an existential going beyond the self that engages the whole man. It is a supra-conceptual union with God, which has different grades. In Dionysius, the mystical union is a new condition which implies a progress, a series of changes, a transition from the created to the uncreated, the acquiring of something which man did not hitherto possess by nature. Here, union means deification. At the same time, while intimately united with God, he knows him only as unknowable, in other words, as infinitely set apart by his nature, remaining even in union, inaccessible in that which he is in his essential being. Apophaticism is not necessarily a theology of ecstasy. It is, above all, an attitude of mind, which refuses to form concepts about God. Such an attitude utterly excludes all abstract and purely intellectual theology which would adapt the mysteries of the wisdom of God to human ways of thought. It is an existential attitude which involves the whole man. There is no theology apart from experience. It is necessary to change, to become a new man. Let me go back and read this 79. So here When he appeared to him in the burning bush, Moses knows God because he realizes that he can't know him. By light, St. Gregory of Nyssa means piety, as a return from the darkness. Scripture teaches that by this that religious knowledge comes at first to those who receive it as light. Therefore, what is perceived to be contrary to religion is darkness, and the escape from darkness comes about when one participates in light. But as the mind progresses, and through an ever greater and more perfect diligence comes to apprehend reality, as it approaches more nearly to contemplation, it sees more clearly that if the divine nature is uncontemplated, this is the true knowledge of what is sought. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing. At each step of this ascent, as one comes upon loftier images or ideas, it is necessary to guard against making of them a concept, an idol of God. Then one can contemplate the divine beauty itself, God insofar as he manifests himself in creation. Speculation gradually gives place to contemplation, knowledge to experience. For in casting off the concepts which shackle the spirit, the apophatic disposition reveals boundless horizons of contemplation. This contemplation of the hidden treasures of the divine wisdom can be practiced in varying degrees with greater or lesser intensity, whether it be a lifting up of the spirit toward God and away from creatures, which allows his splendor to become visible, whether it be a meditation on the Holy Scriptures in which God hides himself, as it were behind a screen, beneath the words which express the revelation, so Gregory of Nyssa, whether it be through the dogmas of the Church or through her liturgical life, whether finally it be through the ecstasy that we penetrate to the divine mystery, this experience of God will always be the fruit of that apophatic attitude. Summing up of his view of apophaticism, Losky comments, unknowability does not mean agnosticism or refusal to know God. Nevertheless, this knowledge will only be attained in the way which leads not to knowledge but to union, to deification. Thus, wouldn't that be a different kind of knowing? Thus, theology will never be abstract, working through concepts, but contemplative, raising the mind to those realities which pass all understanding. This is why the dogmas of the Church often present themselves to the human reason as antinomies. The more difficult to resolve, the more sublime the mystery which they express. We consider Losky's presentation to be accurate, because he sees in apophaticism a general attitude of consciousness in facing the divine mystery and a union with the divine which transforms or deifies man. But we would like to supplement this presentation with certain nuances and additions. In reality, unknowability in a mystical way is joined with knowledge, and in the measure in which we ascend toward the divine mystery, we are filled with more and more knowledge, of course with another kind of knowledge, but also with the knowledge that the divine nature is above all knowledge. Or, in the language of St. Gregory Palamas, the experience on the higher steps isn't called knowledge because of the absence of knowledge, but because of its superabundance. It shouldn't be called knowledge because it is much higher than all knowledge and the viewpoint from knowledge, because knowledge requires linguistic expression, and linguistic expression requires the ability to make something explicit, and making something explicit requires the partialization of that thing into finite, digestible chunks. But God is undigestible unless he condescend to us, and he does so in the Eucharist. But in of himself, in his source, his essence is undigestible. And so he condescends to become a man, uniting himself there, and thereby, through assuming a man, when we consume the undigestible God, God consumes us. But he does so by nature of his undigestibility in the Eucharist. He does so not by destroying us, but by holding us in finitude. God makes us explicit. We cannot make God explicit. So we would like to accentuate more the difference between the unknowability on the lower steps and that on the higher ones of the spiritual ascent. It isn't total on each step. St. Gregory Palamas rejected the idea of Barlaam, that after created nature there is nothing about the divine nature, which is totally inaccessible and unknowable. Although Losky knows the difference between the divine nature and energies, he doesn't concern himself with the vision of the divine light, but speaks only in general of the unknowability of God lived somehow, which is also admitted by more recent Catholic theology. Looks like 84, just here, divine nature is above all knowledge. It is true that St. Gregory of Nyssa writes, "When therefore Moses grew in knowledge, he declared that he had seen God in the darkness. That is, that he had then come to know that what is divine is beyond all knowledge and comprehension. For the text says, Moses approached the dark cloud where God was. The divine word at the beginning forbids that the divine be likened to any of the things known by men, since every concept which comes from some comprehensible image by an approximate understanding and by guessing at the divine nature constitutes an idol of God and does not proclaim God." The Life of Moses, 164-5, pages 95-6. But a little further on, St. Gregory comments, "These things and others similar, being taught by the vision of the tabernacle, the spiritual eye of Moses, borne up by similar visions, is again lifted toward the heights of other meaning." So we would like to accentuate more the difference. Oh, I already read that. 27. The steps of apophaticism. In this and subsequent chapters, we will consider negative theology, apophaticism at the height of prayer, and the apophaticism of the vision of the divine light. For Orthodox Christians, after the knowledge by the intermediacy of nature, of the divine logoi and energies, the knowledge of the divine revealed energies follows. Of course, the knowledge of these energies is accompanied, especially in the second case, by apophaticism. Furthermore, the knowledge of the energies enveloped in nature is accompanied by the consciousness of the unknowability of the divinely revealed energies, and the knowledge of them goes together with the consciousness of the absolute incomprehensibility of the divine nature. Thus, apophaticism is present at the same time as knowledge, or alternatively on both steps, but it is more accentuated in the second. Between the knowledge of the divine logoi and energies through nature, however, which also has something apophatic in it, and the revealed vision of them, there is a hiatus, a gap. This represents an apophaticism almost unmixed with any positive element of knowledge. It is an intermediate apophaticism in which we have left behind every mental operation, even that of negation, but we still haven't received the light. We accentuate, however, that all the time that we know by concepts the divine energies in nature, we have the consciousness that these concepts are inadequate for the energies which are manifested through nature. Then we realize that they are even more sufficient for the divine revealed energies and completely inadequate for the nature of God. In this sense, not only negative intellectual theology, but also comprehension of these energies by feeling, always accompanies or alternates with affirmative theology. Intellectual negative theology is the first form of apophaticism, but just as affirmative theology isn't without the negative, so both are accompanied by apophaticism of an unexplainable feeling of these energies. But with an elevation above that which nature can give us, the consciousness of a hiatus or of the total insufficiency of the concepts taken from nature and the inadequacy of our mind and feeling to know the divinity through them reaches its highest point. In other words, the apophaticism of negative theology and the unspeakable feeling of these energies becomes almost total. It is the supreme consciousness of our inability to know God by human spiritual activity. The moment we leave behind every consideration of concepts taken from nature and every preoccupation even to negate them, when we therefore also raise ourselves beyond negation as an intellectual operation and beyond some apophatic feeling of them, we enter a state of silence produced by prayer. Now we have the second step of apophaticism. It is a much stronger feeling, but one in the darkness of the divine energies, which has surpassed intellectual negative theology and apophatic feeling which goes with it. But we don't think that this second step of apophaticism should be identified with the supreme step of the spiritual ascent either, as it seems to be in Losky. Likewise, we don't think even the mystical theology of Dionysius the Areopagite has this in view, because St. Gregory Palamas has shown, in his polemic with Barlaam, that the Areopagitic texts refer to another darkness, that is, to the supraluminous darkness, which doesn't mean either negative theology alone, nor just any feeling of God in the dark. Rather, it is something else than theology by negation, and even than some apophatic feeling of him in the darkness. It is a darkness not because there is no light in it, but because there is an overabundance of light. It's true that not just anybody is raised to a vision of the divine light, or that it is a permanent state. For those who haven't reached it, or for the moments when they aren't there, negative theology accompanied by some kind of feeling of the divine energies produced by prayer is the highest step. In the best case, they reach the apophaticism of silence, or of a more intense feeling, but in the darkness of the divine energies. Namely, they attain the apophaticism of the second step. St. Gregory Palamas distinguishes the vision of the divine light from the negative theology as an inferior intellectual operation, as a work of the mind which thinks that these affirmative concepts of a certain intellectual content don't fit God. As a work accompanied by a certain apophatic feeling, he also distinguishes it from the apophaticism of the second step, in which there is no longer any intellectual operation whatsoever, but all thought ceases. There is the consciousness of a total inability to understand God with our minds, an exclusive feeling of him in darkness. And now let's see how St. Gregory Palamas distinguishes negative theology, the apophatic feeling which accompanies it, and the stronger one which follows it, as certain lower steps, from the divine light, which in spite of its incomprehensible character has nevertheless something positive compared to the other two steps. We mentioned that St. Gregory sees negative theology as accompanied by the feeling of the presence of God, but we think that he doesn't refer to it because it is extremely reduced in intensity. What then is this union, which isn't anything that exists because it surpasses them? Now, isn't it theology by negation? But it is union and not subtraction. For theology by negation, neither do we need a going out from ourselves ecstasy, when even the angels need it for this union. Furthermore, the light of this theology is in some way knowledge and a rational discourse, gnosis tis kai logos. But the light of this contemplation is seen as possessing objective reality, enipostatos theoretai, working and speaking spiritually in a mystical way in the deified one. In fact, the mind understands things contrary to God, theologizing by subtraction. Here it works discursively by development. But is this union? So a vision of divine light isn't a negative theology. Palamas knows, in addition to this negative theologizing, which is an intellectual operation, because the mind thinks about the things that it is eliminating, and is carried along at the same time by evidence that God is more than it. An additional apophatic state of the soul, before the holy light comes to it. It is a state born during prayer, when the soul abandons all the thoughts of things and goes out of itself. But this exit or ecstasy isn't yet a vision of the light. It is thus a lived apophaticism, experienced in a much more intensive degree than that based on the mental operation which eliminates positive attributes from God. So all along the way, this is actually increasing your longing for God, because as you negate those terms which do not apply to God because of their finitude, or their lesser status, or their being, it actually fills you with a greater desire and longing for the one who is beyond them, as you negate each one in turn. In prayer, the mind gradually leaves relations with the things that exist. First, those that bind it to the shame of things evil and perishable, then those which tie it with things in the middle, between us and God. For this reason, the Fathers advise us not to accept thoughts which the enemy produces in the time of prayer, so we won't be robbed of the better. So the mind, rejecting these things, as well as relations with things superior to them, leaves completely all things that are in the time of pure prayer. This ecstasy, going out, is incomparably higher than theology by negation, because it is proper only to those who have reached dispassion. But still he doesn't have the vision of the light until the Comforter illumines from above the one who is praying in the upper room of the physical extremities and waiting for the promise of the Father, and seizes him by his revelation to contemplate the light. In answer to Barlaam, who argued that the vision of the light is only negative theology, that therefore this represents the supreme step of the spiritual ascent, St. Gregory Palamas replies, "This work, higher than the mind, is superior to that within the mind. They don't know God, not in the sense that they see nothing, as those who conceive him by negation, but by the vision itself they see that which is beyond seeing. Because those who are worthy of this blessed vision, not by prayer, but by a vision of the Spirit, in the Spirit, know that which surpasses vision by this deifying work." Barlaam interpreted, according to his concept, the divine darkness of Dionysius the Areopagite. Barlaam said that only he who has abandoned everything that can be seen and known is able to penetrate it. He argues, as quoted by St. Gregory Palamas, if someone enters this darkness, he does so by the negation of all that exists. Thus this darkness, which is the most perfect contemplation or vision, is nothing but theology by negation, because nothing is beyond the knowing of nothing. So too this light, which you speak of wherever it may be, you must abandon in order to elevate yourself to the theology and contemplation by negation. To this St. Gregory Palamas answers, the divine light, which the mind sees in ecstasy, is a pledge of the light which surrounds the saints in the future life. Now is this an absolute nothingness? Or is it inferior to this nothingness of negative theology? If this were so, we, raising ourselves to negative theology as to a higher step of contemplation, would find ourselves above the blessed state of the saints. So why such an ingenious endeavor to make us abandon the light, which will surround us forever, so that we can enjoy the contemplation, theoria, which you consider all perfect? And if we now can leave behind and surpass this light, but then not, the present age is higher than the one to come. Let's consider, says St. Gregory, the words of Dionysius, which provoked these thoughts. The divine darkness is the inaccessible light. Because of its overwhelming brightness and the exuberant flooding of the supernatural light, he who is worthy to know and to see God reaches this, even by the fact of no longer seeing or knowing. He is raised to that which is above sight and knowledge. He knows exactly what is beyond everything perceptible and intelligible. This is St. Gregory Palamas's answer. So here he says that the same thing is darkness and light. That is seen and not seen, known and not known. How then is that light darkness? Because of the overwhelming outpouring of light. He says, therefore, strictly speaking, it is light. It is darkness in the sense of overabundance, kath hyperoshin, since it is invisible to those who try to approach it and to see it by the senses of the mind. Only those like Moses, who are made worthy to see this light, while by negative theology anyone who honors God can. So this light, strictly speaking, and this darkness, in the sense of overabundance, is something else than theology by negation, and the former surpasses the latter in an incomparable way. Let's say as much as Moses surpasses the multitude in the vision of God. They that practice only this theology by negation. We don't see and don't know anything strictly speaking. Rather, they suffer from a lack of knowledge. They don't see and don't know anything strictly speaking. Rather, they suffer from a lack of knowledge and sight. As a result, they have forgotten themselves. They say that this is true unknowing in the sense of deficiency, higher than all knowledge, and taking pride that they know nothing in the sense of deficiency. If the divine darkness of Dionysius were only this negative theology, argues Palamas, it would also be nothingness, an absence. The divine darkness, however, can't be darkness in a negative sense, nothingness, and absence of any vision whatsoever. It is something positive or suprapositive. if contemplation, theoria by negation, and the divine darkness are one and the same thing, and this contemplation brings about, strictly speaking, a lack of any vision, according to those who say that the further on there is nothing, not even a divine vision, then this divine darkness, too, is strictly speaking a darkness by deficiency, and it makes those who are in it foolish. Negative theology is only an icon which anticipates the vision of the divine light, but it isn't itself that vision. We have examined negative theology in the previous treatises on light. We have shown that it is the icon of that vision, without image and one of fulfillment which the mind enjoys beyond itself in the Holy Spirit, but it isn't the light itself. So all those who have been found worthy of the mystery, baptism, by faith can praise God by negation, but they can't unite with him and see him by the light, unless they receive the supernatural power of vision by the carrying out of the commands. He distinguishes in a subtle way between the vision of the outside from outside the darkness where God is, beyond the human mind, which works by its powers, and the penetration into the interior of this darkness by the mind drawn there by God himself. The first is negative theology. At the most, it can tell us that the darkness in which God dwells is also beyond all images and concepts of things. If then the ascent of Moses would have been only to the vision of that place, it could be rightly dogmatized from this that there is no vision after the theology by negation. Moses went beyond the vision of that place and penetrated to the truly mystical darkness by cessation of every cognitive activity in the sense of eclipse. He was united on a higher step with the unknown one, and saw him and knew him who is beyond mind. How then shall we close the vision in the divine darkness only within the margins of the theology and contemplation by negation? Because he saw it too before he entered the darkness higher than the light, hyperphoton nophon, by that place. But it is possible that Moses is detaching himself from all things and thoughts which are seen and which see, and going beyond the vision of the place and penetrating the darkness saw nothing? But is it possible that Moses, detaching himself from all things and thoughts which are seen and which see, and going beyond the vision of the place penetrating the darkness, saw nothing? But he saw the immaterial ark, which he showed to those below by material imitation. Thus the ark and the things which belong to it, the priesthood and the things which belong to it, are perceptible symbols and veils of the visions of Moses in the divine darkness. However, these visions themselves weren't symbols. Can someone also say, then, that in the divine darkness, and according to theology by negation, no higher vision whatsoever is shown? It has been demonstrated, then, that negative theology, as a lower step, is something else than the vision of the divine light. Likewise, that between it and the vision of the divine light there is also an intermediate apophaticism, experience in an existential way by our whole being, in a culminating state of prayer, as a feeling in the darkness of the presence of God and as a total quietness of the mind. The first two states affect man by his natural powers, aided, of course, by the grace received at baptism and in the mystery of the holy chrismation. By them the mind reaches the abyss which separates its knowledge from God, but it is still here on the human side, but carried off by God. It goes over there to the vision of the divine light. Certainly the vision of the divine light is also accompanied by an apophaticism, which we could call the third step, but it is no longer an apophaticism in the sense of a void, as the two previous ones. First, it consists of the consciousness of the one who sees it, that it can't be contained in concepts and expressed in words. Secondly, that beyond it is the divine being, which remains totally inaccessible, and that this accessible light itself remains infinitely inexhaustible, but it has a positive content of knowledge higher than knowledge, of apophatic knowledge, a feeling higher than experience, and of natural feeling. As we have said, the vision of the light means that it has carried the mind across the abyss which separates us and God, so that it is no longer on this side of natural knowledge, but on the other. This is why we treat negative theology and apophaticism in the second part of this book, and the vision of the light in the third, along with the union of the soul with God. Hoscher claimed that hesychasm abandoned the Eastern tradition of joining the affirmative with the negative in expressing the mystical experience, that it kept only the affirmation of the vision of the divine light. This isn't so. The first treatise of the first series and the third of the last of St. Gregory Palamas's defense of hesychasm never stop calling the vision of the divine light knowledge above understanding, or unknowing in the sense of surpassing. The divine light seen in an incomprehensible image also remains for hesychasm a mystery. It doesn't exclude, but implicates apophaticism without leaving it by itself. What distinguishes this apophaticism from the vision higher than the vision of light is the fact that it isn't a void, but an overwhelming divine presence. And it isn't an intellectual negation and a feeling of the darkness of the presence of God, but an overwhelming experience of this presence. Furthermore, the divine light isn't entirely known by just anyone at the beginning, but its knowledge is an eternal progress, according to the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. The consciousness of this unending reserve of light, but strictly speaking, it isn't an awareness, as neither is the incomprehensibility of the divine nature, is an unceasing experience in the seer of the light. If, however, he becomes holy light, this doesn't mean that he fully understands, but he becomes full of mystery as a deified supernatural being, and he is continuously surprised by what has happened to him. We'll go back to Hoscher, 98. Hoscher says, the theology of the whole light cannot integrate the superluminous darkness, and this is why it hasn't conceived the idea of joining under the same symbol the dark and the happy light, knowing and unknowing, light and obscurity, union and disintegration, joy and the suffering of contemplation. To remark in passing, Palamism has nearly eliminated darkness from its theology. Due to the real distinction between essence and energies of God, it has dissociated the Dionysian notion of a total unknowing, which is the knowledge of him who is above everything which can be known. Dionysius the Areopagite, Epistle 1. We have now, on the one hand, total unknowing of the essence, and on the other, knowledge of the energies, which is no longer darkness. To the extent that the contemplation can become complete light in connection with the energies and remain total darkness in connection with the divine essence. But in such a way, too, the Dionysian idea is lost in depth, and we enter or remain in the Evagrian intellectualism, or in the something of Maximus. Well, so what he's saying, the reason that's wrong is basically what he's defending is he's like Palamas is defending the idea that the experience of the presence of God that one encounters after one removes all created intermediaries is experienced not as absence but presence, not as emptiness but fullness. But that fullness is not something that then you can drop down into categorizations, created categorizations, and have it remain the same thing. He's defending the idea that the longing that we feel can ever increase, and such that the goal, once you reach beyond all negations of finite forms of sustenance, is eternal food, is eternal abundance. that cannot be digested, but instead digests you in itself. I mean, it's a defense of the Eucharist. In the West, the one who understood the darkness of Dionysius in this positive way was Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. He explained this darkness not as an absence of light, nor as a real mixture of darkness and light, as Hauscher wanted to have it for the Hesychasm, but as an abundance of light, which by this very fact overwhelms the vision, and can be called not only light, but darkness too. But let's talk a little more about the apophatic steps, beginning with the first. Nicholas of Cusa, however, this is Nicholas of Cusa. He, however, who leaves behind the visible light enters in a necessary way into something which is no longer visible light, and therefore for the eye it is darkness. And when he finds himself in this darkness, which is a darkening for the eye, and knows that he is in a darkness caused by the incapacity of his eyes, he also knows that which has penetrated before the sun, because that darkness for the eye comes from the supraluminosity of the sun. (28) Negative and positive theology, a dynamic relationship. Negative theology is still a mental operation. The final one, mixed, however, as prayer is, with a feeling of the powerlessness to comprehend God. It is related to the comprehension of God through nature, history, Holy Scripture, art, dogma, and in general through everything which is between us and God, either as an external reality or as a system of concepts and symbolic images. Every reality, concept, or symbolic image mirrors God, as well as awakens in us the proof or inexplainable feeling that God is totally different in comparison with them. So they compel us to negate all the positive attributes which, because of them, we ascribe to God. In other words, all things in between open for us a perspective to God. And at the same time, they confront us with an infinite abyss of divine reality which we can't grasp with our minds, and which, first of all, doesn't show us anything that created realities, concepts, and symbolic images do. But our mind, faced with this abyss, still doesn't give up looking at things, concepts, and symbolic images, but turns its gaze from this to that and finds that they don't give it the means to describe the abyss. It tries, we might say, to measure it with every measure in the world. In other words, with every attribute or image, or with every concept based on created things. Finally, the mind realizes that not one is suitable, so it eliminates them one by one. Negative theology is therefore a mental operation because it investigates the content of various attributes and concepts and compares them with the divine abyss, which it lives somehow with feeling, and finds that they are insufficient. In a certain sense, negative theology is still a rational operation. It is still an exact weighing of each concept, whose limits only now appear to the mind in all their clarity. But the comprehension of the definite content of a concept is made at the same time as we cast our gaze over the divine abyss which reason can't encompass, but which the mind gains by intuition, by a look or feeling of another nature. So this operation, although on the one hand mental, isn't only rational, not only deductive, but has an intuitive element in it, the ascertaining of which is limitless, and therefore can't be described, because only something with limits can be described. It is a rational operation by which the mind concludes, nevertheless, that reason is insufficient. St. Gregory Palamas says, "But we too know that in negative theology, the things which negate God, the mind understands." Jacob Bohm makes a distinction between reason, which can't comprehend much, and understanding, Vernunft, Verstand, which, without eliminating or covering the mystery, penetrates it. e core, whatever that is, we attribute this capacity of understanding, or at least of the discernment of the mystery, to the mind, which is the largest faculty of knowledge. Reason is only a part of it, the discursive. Reason is often, in its function, accompanied by the mind, which sees more than it does. So much so that many times reason stifles or scorns the mind's view. But in negative theology, the mind imposes its more decisive role. It is an operation by which reason itself becomes conscious of its limits and of its inability to lay hold of the totally different and infinite one. With its gaze, the mind doesn't abandon the solid shore of definite things, but aided by its own kind of feeling, noira aesthesis, it goes from definite things to the divine abyss. It hesitates between the two. Negative theology doesn't discard or forget, as being totally useless, the positive concepts gathered from the created world, because even if it sees that they don't correspond to God, nevertheless, only in comparison with them does it find that God is something else. The mind considers these concepts one by one when it negates them in relationship to God. Therefore, negative theology doesn't eliminate the enriching of our spirit with concepts ever higher and more enhanced. It also measures divinity with them and always finds it incomprehensible, so the feeling of divinity's unsurpassable glory overwhelms us even more. In this sense, the knowledge of God is a dynamic process, as a Christian thinker describes it. The limits which are imposed by agnosticism do not exist. The gnosis which searches for truth further and further afield and ever more deeply is an effective possibility. For the process of knowing God is a movement of the Spirit which has no end, but the mystery always remains and can never be exhausted. Negative theology needs positive terms to negate, and the loftier they are, the more subtle, the better they express the richness of the power and imagination of God who created the realities expressed by them, and by their negation they also make an icon, a negative one, of the divine glory, which is also higher than they are. Negative theology doesn't justify a laziness of the spirit, an abdication of reason, but requires a continual raising of the scaffolding of reason. Then, on the higher steps, the limitless divine ocean can appear to us in a vision which will thrill us even more. Negative theology, far from forever insisting on the renunciation of rational concepts, longs for their growth. It is the supra-rational point of the untiring exertions of reason, which must never stop its investigation of nature, of human life, of Scripture. Any progress whatsoever in the knowledge of physical, biological, and psychological processes within the womb of creation means a new level on the scaffold from which negative theology, guided by a feeling of the mind, gains a deeper and broader view of the divine incomprehensibility, which at the same time itself makes possible the continuous building up of this scaffold. So we don't think that the disrespect with which some Orthodox theologians speak about positive theology is right. If the world and Scripture are the revelations of God, and they tell us something positive about Him, it is clear that positive theology has its rights. How would it be if we no longer said anything positive about God, not even that He is? Wouldn't religious life itself be endangered in the absence of any affirmation? What would happen if we wouldn't say that God is great and full of love? If God hasn't revealed Himself by creation, and that we haven't known Him at all by supernatural revelation? But once He has been pleased to reveal Himself by them, we must use them to say something positive about Him. It is true that positive theology is a theology of the finite, but far from excluding the infinite, it makes the ascent to Him possible, which is why the body and blood are so important. The bringing together of the created and the uncreated. That Christ entering the created and uniting there is what enables the ascent to the uncreated. This is important. Page 247. Only if it is used without negative theology does it have but a limited character, being adapted to this world and to the natural man, so that it possesses only a pragmatic and juridical value. The divine reality is infinite and inexhaustible and cannot fit into rational concepts. Therefore, we must say only that positive theology has the continuous need for negative, that just as the negative does for the positive. He who emphasizes negative theology, however, borrows the terms of positive theology, which he continually negates. More than that, he must first have tried, and continually be trying to approach the divinity with the terms of positive theology in order to know that they don't fit it, and consequently to negate them. In other words, someone can't use negative theology except in alternation with the positive. The cause for this is found in the human spirit, but not only there, it is something deeper. Strictly speaking, there are two deeper causes. First, the ultimate creative principle which made existence and which can explain it can't be as the world itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the ultimate principle and transcend it to the world. The created being would differ from the uncreated world. Second, this principle and this source must include everything which can explain existence and the content of that world. So the absolute and transcendent principle can't contain every one of the qualities which are found in the world, or in any of its parts. It can't be a part of the world, not even a basis of the world. If the same essence as it is, neither existence itself as we know it, of the same essence as it is, neither existence itself as we know it, because this existence requires its explanation in something superior to it, other than it. It can't be anything but the negation of existence, if we understand by this the imperfect form of the existence of the world, the only one which we know. Going back, Corriere says, repeating the thought of Jacob Bohm, on the other hand, it is clear that it is precisely created nature which allows us to elevate ourselves toward God in this quality of its creator and foundation. If the created world didn't exist, presupposing that we would still be present to ask such a question, we wouldn't know anything about God. If God wouldn't make himself known through nature, if he wouldn't have created, but would have remained eternally in himself without revealing himself, we would know absolutely nothing about him, because we wouldn't exist. It is the negation of any category of this existence. To sum it up, it is non-existence. But because of the absolute principle is the source of the power which has made everything, which has made possible the existence which we know and which explains the nature of all things, it must have a certain relationship with things and with the world. It must have a certain likeness with things, of which it is the creative and fundamental principle. Existence, with all its variety, must have something in which makes it possible on the basis of certain logoi and energies, which correspond to different attributes of the world. Thus, even in the relationship of this created principle with the created world stands the cause which we must speak about in contradictory terms, those of positive and negative theology. In a way, all attributes of the world fit it, but at the same time, not one is adequate, not even existence. This creative principle is the same for all things and is shared by all things, and at the same time is absolutely other, totally unlike them. On the one hand, it is inaccessible to understanding, because it completely transcends it. But on the other hand, because something which can't be understood can't in any way be a principle of the world, it must be understood to some extent in order to explain all things by it. So both ways of approaching the absolute, the positive and negative, are equally necessary and legitimate. They are both likewise insufficient. The first cause, as Dionysius the Areopagite puts it, is above affirmations and negations. Both are needed to properly direct the mind toward him, but neither do the two together reach all the way to him. Neither do the two together reach all the way to him. If God were only finite in relationship to the world, and not different from it too, negative theology wouldn't be necessary. It would be enough to extend with the imagination to the infinite, every attribute of the world by the so-called lofty way of analogy, and we would have an attribute of God. But this would mean that God is in a continuity of nature with the world. So even if there were a difference between him and it, this wouldn't be a difference of nature between God and the world. Yet God isn't only infinite, but also absolutely other than the world. So the lofty way, via eminentiae, isn't enough, or the method of analogy to correct the insufficiency of positive theology. God is absolutely indeterminable, not just because every determination is complete with the finite, as he is infinite, but especially because no category whatsoever of existence which we know fits him. while at the same time neither does the more general category, that of existence, fit him. In fact, his existence isn't incorporated, so to speak, in the larger kind of existence as such, but he is outside and above existence in general. Not even the words is or exists, with which we designate everything that is more general, which is common to all things and beings, are suitable for him, because neither do they take us out of the created order. So just the amplification of the attributes of the world to the infinite isn't enough to characterize him, not even their correction by analogical attributive. After this, negative theology is still necessary. It considers that even the equivocal idea of analogy must be negated, no matter how many possibilities it leaves for keeping God very distinct from the world, even though, on the other hand, the things in the world must have a certain analogy with God. 2. Another justification for negative theology, but in alternation with the positive, is the fact that the nature of God is other than that which is its manifestations and its works show. All the names which we give to God refer to these manifestations or works which show their effect in the things and attributes of the world. They do not show the divine nature. Therefore, on the one hand, we give God many names. On the other, he is the unnamed. By nature, of no name is suitable to him. When we think of the manifestations of God, we make positive manifestations about him. But when we think about his nature, we negate all affirmation. The names which we give God refer to the divine energies which descend to us, according to St. Basil, not to his nature, which remains inaccessible. They refer to the powers which radiate as so many rays from God, proodoi, creating and sustaining different aspects of the world. Being is the name which is given to the being creating energy. Wisdom to the energy which creates wisdom, says Dionysius the Areopagite. Above them, however, is the divine hiddenness, to which no name can be given, and which enters into no relation, eschitos, and isn't imparted at all. For all divine things, even those that are revealed to us, are only known by their communications. Their ultimate nature, which they possess in their own original being, is beyond mind and beyond all being and knowledge. For instance, if we call the super-essential mystery, hyperousion kryphiotita, by the name God, or life, or being, or light, or word, we conceive of nothing else than the powers that stream forth therefrom to us, bestowing Godhead, being, life, or wisdom. But that hiddenness remains above, hyperkeitai, these powers. It is above being, above divinity, hypertheos, above life, above every name and impartation. Certainly, our names, borrowed from the effects of the divine energies in the world, don't adequately... Well, let me read this. The divine names, these are called the beneficent emanations of the Supreme Godhead. Certainly our names, borrowed from the effects of the divine energies in the world, don't adequately touch even these energies, so the negation of names is justified if and when we think of them. But nevertheless, we can attribute these names to them, adding to them the coefficient of a use by analogy. For there is no exact similitude between the creatures and the creative originals, for the creatures possess only such images of the creative originals as are possible to them, while the originals themselves transcend and exceed the creatures by the very nature of their own originality. St. Gregory of Nyssa also develops at length the idea that the nature of God is higher than anything, and that we can comprehend all the names from what he does in relationship to our life, and that therefore these names refer to these multiple actions. For God is not an expression, neither hath he his essence in voice or utterance, but our God is of himself what also he is believed to be, but he is names. He is names by those who call upon him, not what he is essentially. But he is names by those who call upon him, not what he is essentially, for the nature of him who alone is unspeakable. But he receives his appellations from what are believed to be his operations in regard to our life, his energeia. Whereas no name corresponds to the divine nature, we use many names, making it as far as possible for each of us to understand something about him from the wide variety of their meanings. From works the human mind expresses as much as it can. For as saith the wisdom of Solomon, by the greatness and beauty of creatures, proportionably the maker of them is seen. But in applying such appellations to the divine essence, which passeth all understanding, we do not seek to glory in it by the names we employ, but to guide our own selves by the aid of such terms toward the comprehension of the things which are hidden. The Holy Fathers, in order to show that the divine nature can't be known, that it is something else than its manifestations, give us an example of created things, whose nature also remains inaccessible. We pass our lives in ignorance of much, being ignorant first of all of ourselves as men, and then of all things beside. For who is there who has arrived at a comprehension of his own soul? Who is acquainted with its very essence? But how can he who is ignorant of himself take knowledge of anything that is above himself? And if a man is familiarized with such ignorance of himself, is he not plainly taught by the very fact not to be astonished at any of the mysteries that are without? Wherefore also of the elements of the world we know only so much by our senses as to enable us to receive what they severally supply for our living. For as they who would indicate some person, as of good parentage and descent or rich, in so speaking, they do not set forth the nature of the person, but give certain notes of recognition, thus to the expressions of the Holy Scripture, that he is without cause and without limit. They are from the things around him, ekton periton aton, but his very essence, as not to be conceived by the human intellect, or expressed in words, this it has left untouched as a thing not to be made the subject of curious inquiry, ruling that it be revered in silence, and that it forbids the investigation of the things too deep for us, while it enjoins the duty of being slow to utter any word before God. And St. Gregory Palamas, speaking of the relationship between many energies of God and his simple nature, says, God has all these. Better said, he is above all things, unitary and undivided, just as the soul has unitarily in it all the powers by which it cares for the body. Because just as the soul, even when the eyes are blind and eyes deaf, has in it the powers to care for the soul, so even when there is no world, God has in himself the providential powers of the world. And as the soul is one and simple and uncomposed, not multiplying and not being composed because of the powers which are in it and come out of it, the same with God, although he is not only multi-powerful but all-powerful, doesn't lose his simplicity and unity because of the powers which come from him, inasmuch as God is a being above being, unspeakable and unthinkable, without outside relations and non-partakeable, inasmuch as, however, he is the being of things and of the life of the living and of the wisdom of the wise, he is conceived of, named, and partaken of by the created. So because of the fact that, by his hidden nature, God is unknowable, but by his works which come to the world and are mirrored in their created effect, he is knowable, stands the necessity of expressing God antinomically, in other words, in positive terms, immediately replaced by the negative. Thus, on the one hand, we must say that God is life, according to his life-creating power, which he manifested by working in the world. And on the other hand, we must say that he isn't life, because the hidden nature from which the life-giving power comes and acts in the world isn't identified with this, but is greater than it. God is a nature, wisdom, power, goodness, according to the powers which come from him, according to the manifestations in the world. But his nature, as an infinite source of innumerable powers, isn't any one of these things, or all of them together. He is more than all of them and is totally indeterminable. They are all from God's nature, uncreated and inseparable from it, but nevertheless they are not identical with it. The nature of God isn't any one of these things, but not in the sense of the lack of them, but of the surpassing of them. Kath hyperochian, says Palamas. God, on the one hand, is existence, on the other hand, he isn't, but not in the sense that he doesn't exist, but that he is above existence. Our soul and its manifestations offer an analogy of this relationship between the nature and powers of God, and thus an illustration of the necessity of alternating positive and negative terms in relationship to him. For example, we can say that he is mind, will, feeling, movement, if we think of all his acts of thought, will, feeling, of movement. But immediately we must correct ourselves and say that he is neither thought nor will, feeling, movement, because as the source of all these actions, he is more than all of them and isn't depleted by them. He remains forever above, as a center distinct from them and indeterminable. Bulgakov makes a distinction between the I, transcendent to our knowledge and determination, between the nameless I, from that indicated by a substitute for a name, a pronoun, and between its physical, voluntary, and intellectual manifestations, as Palamas does between the absolute transcendent nature of God and his works, which enter into a relationship with the world and are made known. Only by them do we know something about them, about him. They are his predicates. They designate a property or relation. The I is truly real. Nevertheless, it doesn't exist in the ranks of the existences in the usual sense, just as the center of a circle isn't the usual point on the surface of the circle, as it is often asserted in geometry. It could be said that the I isn't existence in the usual sense, so neither can it be expressed. For the concept is a symbol of existence, a taking hold of it. It fully belongs to the sphere of existence, of which the I doesn't. Even so, the word I is for everyone an intelligible, mystical sign which points to the depths of the inexpressible, to the depths of the darkness, from which the light frequently tears away a little piece, which becomes light, because it divines something of itself. The I points to the depths of the unspeakable, of the total indefinable, to the depths of the supraluminous shadows, to the ultimate supra-existential source, from which something continually spills over to the knowable surface. The I is the subject of the sentence for any predicate whatsoever, for anything that can be said about it. It is, however, above everything which can be said about it. It is our physical subject, in other words, that sea continually moved by states, experiences, excitement, passions of the noumenal I, and not only the physical subject, but also the gnosiological I. In other words, its step forward in existence. In the ultimate analysis, the I must be determined antinomically, in the same way as negative theology. On the one hand, the I is a full and definite no, because in the usual sense it isn't. But nevertheless, it doesn't become a zero, a vacuum, a non-existence, because it has supra-existence. On the one hand, the I is everything, because the whole can become its predicate. The tie between I and the predicate can't be severed for a moment. And I think that's all I have time for, but I'm just going to comment on that. So that came up in Arjakovsky's What is Orthodoxy, in his discussion of how we relate to God, and that the relationship of the I to the self that's explicated by what's his name, Jean-Luc Marion, is that the I is something distinct from the self, in that the I is the unity that apprehends the self and its parts, that no thing is just a sum of their parts, and the thing that unifies it stands behind it or beyond it. And it is that unity that stands before all particular parts of the person. It's that unity that also turns toward God and has something in common with God, with the I am, or something like that. I'm not getting that exactly right, but I don't have any more time, so